Here we go. Technical session number 47, continuing on our journey talking about security. I want to start talking about securing our networks, Soho wireless and wireless networks. After this technical session, we should be able to explain the value of going the extra effort to protect the data on a Soho network. And what does Soho stand for?
Small office, home office.
There we go. Small office, home office. It's not just a place in New York. All right. We should also be able to describe the strategies for securing both wired and wireless Soho networks. Describe the unique strategies for securing a wireless Soho network as well. BSMs we need to take into account with regards to this technical session, the adaptability. The threats facing our networks are ever changing, and we must be able to change with them. We must proactively be doing research to see what threats are starting to gain in popularity throughout the ecosphere and how they're being countered. So when and if that issue comes to our company, we can properly count it, if not prevent it outright. Also, persistence. Not giving up is why we're here day in and day out. We're already showing this behavioral skill on a regular basis and continuing to develop it. And even though we may be in a tier 1 or tier 2 or tier 3, we may come across problems that we do not know how to solve. We must continue them to the end. Be detectives, so to speak. And then if we have to hand it off to a superior or a higher tier, follow up and find out what it took to solve that actual problem. All right. The importance of protecting Soho routers. Essentially, whether you're wired or wireless, if you don't configure your routers properly, a hacker can create a whole lot of havoc for your network by just getting into your routers. Show of hands, how many people, after we talked about it before, went in and changed the administrative sign-in and password on their home routers to secure it a little more? 2, 3, 4, 5. There we go. Anybody have yet to do this? If so, I just would like to ask, who is your internet provider? That's all I need. And maybe your IP address.
And also your social security number for just
the
giving
last
out
4. We don't need
information.
the whole thing. I mean, we're not that mean. Just the last 4. So if you fail to do this, then they can basically come in and own your network. They can change your security settings. They can lock you out of your own network. They can do all sorts of things. They can gain access to your routers due to a failure to configure them properly. And here's the thing is we can actually set your routers to not throw out error codes when attempting to log in or trying to do things, because those error codes will lead specifically to the type of router you have, because they tend to be equipment specific, especially on enterprise level routers. And if I know the exact make and model of router you have, if you haven't been keeping up with your security, I know a couple dozen ways to breach the security on that router at that point. So we need to be very diligent about things like this, because that's one of the first things they're going to check. Has the basic admin password even been changed? Because they tend to be pretty similar across the board. So other things they can do once they have access, they can steal bandwidth. You know, if you don't lock your Wi-Fi network, they can log into it. My next door neighbor was gracious enough to provide us with internet for a couple of years. Then one day they locked it.
Intentionally?
Huh?
Intentionally?
I like to think so.
So nice of him.
I know. I thought it was great. But then they had guests come visit for Christmas, and the internet train ended at that point.
Did you confront him?
What?
Hey neighbor, our internet. Are you having problems with your internet? 'Cause I am.
Have you tried resetting your router?
That is so funny. That's
Hey. I was a poor college student, and I couldn't even afford internet at that point. So
it's awful.
hey, do what you got to do. Although it's funny the looks I would get from people when they ask me, you know, like if I watch such and such show, and I'm like, I haven't had cable since the 90s. So they can steal your internet bandwidth. And while they're on there stealing that internet bandwidth, they could be performing disruptive or illegal acts like piracy. They could be, if they are willing to go ahead and just steal your internet by, logging into it, why has it got to stop there? They could download pirated music and movies or what have you. I swear I've never done this in my life. And, if traced back, they're going to go to the person who owns that network, not necessarily the person next door who's been stealing it. So there's that. And then you have the possibility that if they really know what they're doing, rather than just getting into an open network, they could be stealing your sensitive information. There are free tools out there. For those who are interested in the security field, there's a free tool you can download called Wireshark. And Wireshark, when you log into a wireless network, will capture, as you turn it on and turn it off, will capture all packets transmitted on that wireless network and record them all. If the transmissions are not encrypted, they can read them in plain text. This is a free tool. You can download it in 5 minutes. So if you're sending out, emails, logging in, using passwords, all that fun stuff, they're able to read all that, which is part of why they say, be very careful when using open networks like Starbucks and stuff like that, because they'll log into that network, turn on Wireshark, and just start recording. They'll record all that data. And then when they get home, they'll sift through it for all the goodies. And then they'll get credit card numbers, telephone numbers, addresses, bless you. All kinds of stuff based off of what they were able to just glean sitting in a coffee shop. Most people sit there and think, oh, it must be a college student or somebody working on a paper or something like that. A lot of times it's just a hacker just siphoning for information. But that changes your point of view when you walk into Starbucks next time. See the guy sitting there with the laptop, like, I know what you're doing.
I posted the link in the chat to the Wireshark.
There we go.
Okay.
Let's go ahead and spread this tool around. It's a
Well,
fun
no,
one.
it's a good one to look into. It's got a
Yes,
lot of good information.
Yes, absolutely. And it's kind of neat to see. It lets you look at internet packets, what they look like, from, in a transmission stage. It lets you see the three-way and the four-way handshake individually, so you can break all this stuff down. It's kind of neat to use and just like become familiar with these tools, because if you're going to look into security, this is one you will be using.
Yeah.
So it's not like the black background with the green ones and zeros coming down like on the Matrix.
That would be cool.
It
But
doesn't look
again,
like that.
we'll have to refer to that 30-second video we showed at the beginning, is like what people think IT people do at work versus what they really do.
Right.
So they're, through tools like Wireshark, they're able to perform or steal sensitive information from you. You're able to perform a denial of service attack where you can essentially make the network unusable. And denial of service sounds all fancy, but it literally could be you just going in and turning off a router. That's a denial of service. If you go in with a hammer and smash their servers, that's denial of service. You have denied them access to it. It could be something extremely sophisticated down to something extremely crude. It just basically means you have denied people access to the systems. Also, if they own your routers, they can pretty much inject in there whatever they want, so they can infect the network with malicious software, Trojans, worms, viruses, and the like. Questions so far? All right. Looking at a basic overview, we're going to be talking about some of the stuff we've touched on before. Some of it we might be new to you at this point. So we'll be talking about changing default usernames and passwords. We just talked about that briefly, especially with regards to your routers and stuff like that. Enabling MAC filtering. Now, in reality, not a huge security deal, but with regards to CompTIA A+, they consider this a security measure. Assigning static IP addresses within your network, and then you can IP filter. Creating a DMZ, or demilitarized zone. Port forwarding and mapping, or triggering. Your firewall settings, and then content filtering and parental controls. So you can filter it by type of content. Disabling ports, physical and software ports. Updating your firmware, and then physical security. All right. Changing default usernames and passwords. Always do this, because they tend to be very generic. And if a malicious actor knows just your internet provider or the company you purchased your router from, if they know that, they can get down to a handful of guesses to get into your router. If they know your internet provider and you're using the same router your internet provider gave you, it's likely just one password, like one guess, they're in. So you need to go in, change these, set them up, and then if there are any guest accounts, you need to delete guest accounts, because that is typically a backdoor into systems as well, unfortunately. And any account that is older or not needed, disable that as well. In lieu of a guest account, you create another user account and then just have heavy restrictions on that user. So if you're going to have guests come over to your house, you don't have to give them access to your computer. You can have a guest login, but it's not technically a guest account. It's just another user account. Yes, Avery. Or not. All right, MAC filtering. Utilizing the MAC address and basically stating if you only have if you have a very low number of devices, maybe 10 that are going to be on your network at any given time, you can basically take the MAC addresses of all those devices, enter them into a whitelist for MAC filtering, And then you put that into place. And then if essentially anything that is on that list is permitted, everyone else is denied. So it works when you have a very limited number of devices on your network. Unfortunately, as we had talked about, creating a virtual machine with a virtual NIC and then spoofing a known MAC address from that network will grant you access through that system. It is very quick and easy workaround to bypass this. So with regards to CompTIA, it is considered a security feature. In reality, not so much. Questions so far? All right. Assigning static IPs. This only works, again, like MAC filtering, on small networks. So you can get by without utilizing your DHCP to issue IP addresses, because this will put an unnecessary burden on your IT staff, because you have to keep very careful track of all the IPs, who they're assigned to, when they're assigned, and being able to retract them whenever equipment is being decommissioned or people are leaving the organization. So and then at that point, you can filter by IPs, and only those hosts with those IP addresses would be allowed access to the network. Although, again, like we were saying, IP addresses, if it is a known computer that is allowed access to the network because of its IP, it is not very difficult to discover what the IP address of that computer is, being able to spoof that so that you can gain access to the system. All right. Next, DMZ, or demilitarized zone. It's an area in between two firewalls where you can place public server for access by people who you might not trust otherwise. You can put email servers, web servers, things of that nature in this little area, and you would isolate that server essentially within the DMZ, and it would not have access to other areas of your network, but would still be granted access to the public. So you wouldn't have to grant them access to accounting, research and development, HR, operations, sales, all that fun stuff can be protected behind a secondary firewall, while this stuff is still accessed from outside users, people who are wanting to purchase things from the company, utilizing web servers, things of that nature. Questions? All right. Port forwarding or mapping. They are synonymous with each other. So it is essentially the act of mapping one port to another. So say I have my annotator actually up. So we have a security camera, webcam, and it goes out to our server and goes out to the internet. So as this is a web camera, I didn't buy it through Blink or Amazon or something like that, where I would be utilizing their services on their networks. I don't fully trust them, so I want a web camera on my service that only I have access to. So this camera itself would have a sign-in and password, but and an IP address, because it's a network device, and it would receive traffic on port 80. Because it is a web server, essentially, how I would access that and be able to look at the camera. So port 80. Well, any hacker who's going to come by, they're going to run a port scan on well-known ports. So they're going to be looking for stuff on port 80 because it's one of the most well-known, right? So I don't want to have my outward-facing network have port 80 send it to my internal security cameras. That would be kind of scary, wouldn't it? So what I may do is I will pick an ephemeral port, one of the really high number ones, like 45, 11, or 45, 111. So pick a port like that. I would pick some obscure port. And then when I ping into the IP address of my system, I would designate this specific port number when I'm trying to access. So you remember when you're typing in the IP address of your system, you can designate a port by doing what? So when I'm typing in like an IP address, I can actually designate a specific port. How would I do that?
A colon at the end and put the number.
Exactly, Renzi. Perfect. Yes, you would put a colon after the IP address if it's an IPv4. So you have the IPv4, and then you put a colon, and then you could put the specific port number you want to send that traffic to. So I can send like from my home, and I want to look at the security cameras in the office. I can ping the IP address or send a connection to the IP address of my office at this specific port number. And so what will happen is when my router receives a request on that IP with this specific port number, it is going to forward it to the camera on port 80. So the moment it receives that communication on that specific port, it's immediately going to forward that traffic to the correct port on the device or server or computer that I designate. And that is considered port forwarding. And the IP address I would designate would be the IP of my main router. Though the internal IP or private IP of the computer may be different, or the camera may be different, because of the specific port number I've requested, it triggers it to send the traffic directly to that camera. Any questions on that?
Can you repeat that? How that works again? I'm sorry.
No problem. So we have a camera here on, and it is a web camera that we didn't want to go through a specialized service to go to a website to look at our cameras and stuff like that. We wanted it all done internally. So we bought a webcam that we would control totally at that point. However, the webcam is designed so that it receives traffic only on port 80, which is HTTP, right? So that is our web traffic portal. Now, as that is a very common port, and when hackers are trying to access you, will typically go for your most common ports first. We don't want to utilize that port because that would allow them instant access to our cameras. So what we do is we pick a very high number ephemeral port. So we have the 45111 port number right here attached to our router. And so when we hit the IP, when we type in the IP address for our router, and then we put the colon in this port number here, this 45111, when that hits the router's automatically going to forward that traffic to this specific camera because we have designated whenever you receive something on this port, it forwards to this device. So remember, there's 65,000 ports on a computer. It would take a long time to port scan all that. Plus, it would raise alarm bells if you start pinging every port on a computer or on a border router on a network. If they start receiving pings, basically going down the line of ports, they may block traffic from that IP. So putting it in a just obscure high-level port allows you to forward that traffic and give you direct access. Does that make sense? So that is port forwarding. You have the ability to do stuff like this on your home routers. So if you go around and you play around in the settings on your routers at your house, you have the ability to set up port forwarding. So, you know, if you want to set up webcams, security cams, gaming servers, stuff like that, you can do that through port forwarding. And then we get to port triggering. And the ports are only turned on when needed as opposed to being on all the time. So when traffic is detected on a specific outbound port, the gateway remembers that computer's IP address and then triggers the inbound port to accept incoming traffic. Most common port you see this happen on is ports 20 and 21, which is what?
FTP.
FTP. So when you make a request on port 20 for FTP, it tends to respond on port 21. So when you can set up a port trigger, so if somebody makes a communication on port 20, it will go ahead and open up port 21 to receive communication back. So it creates that two-way communication. So you can have these ports closed on a regular basis, but when you initiate a conversation, it triggers port 21 to open up. So when the response comes back, it's able to get through the firewalls. So one event triggers the other. Your outbound communication triggers the router to open up the inbound port that it's going to come back on. Questions on that?
So forwarding, why would you do that? Is it just because port 80 is like unsecure?
Well, port 80 would be like a general web server. And the thing is the actual security on these webcams is going to be relatively low compared to your network security. And so anything that would come in through port 80, we don't want them just having, you know, easy access to all of our security cameras, because then they can monitor, you know, do we have guards? What time does everybody go home? What time does everybody come to work? You know, they can glean a lot of information just watching our security cameras. So, you know, we wouldn't want them to have that level of access. So rather than just grant that access for them coming in on port 80, we change it to a very obscure port so that we would know it and we could trigger it on the way in rather than granting everybody access. And again, it could be for if you have network attached storage at your house and you have files there and you just want to be able to, you know, for safety's sake, have access to that while you're on the road. You travel for business, the USB drive that you stored your presentation on got damaged, doesn't work. So you can use an obscure port to gain access to your personal files at your house, re-download that presentation, and you're good to go. So it allows you to create essentially a backdoor into your system for yourself if you so choose. Anything to add to that, Avery?
No, I think that's a great example of, you know, just making sure you use obscure ports. So that way only, in theory, only you will know how to access it.
Yeah. I mean, over time, if they're continually trying to attack your network,
Yeah,
they
if
will
you-
eventually scan all your ports.
Yeah.
But the thing is on a personal level at your house, that's highly unlikely unless you have some really super sensitive information that people want to get to. It's highly unlikely a hacker is going to spend the time actually trying to access your network. But in a corporate sense, hopefully you would have security measures in place that would trigger warnings that you're being scanned, essentially.
Yeah.
And that would allow you to confront the threat at that point. All right. Next, firewall settings. So both wired and wireless firewalls should have settings on them to be able to enable firewalls essentially to protect them. They may have a built-in firewall feature, although some people may opt for a hardware version rather than the software version, because those tend to be a more robust system. And it will allow you to be able to filter out that kind of traffic. What are the two main types of firewalls we see other than hardware and software? So what are the two types of firewalls?
Stateless and I don't remember the second one.
Stateless,
Stateful.
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 What is the other term we use for stateless?
Packet filtering?
Packet filtering. Very good. So yeah, packet filtering. So stateful firewalls do what?
Allow communication that was that started inside of the network to receive a response back in from outside.
Very good. So stateful firewalls pay attention to the state of the conversation, and the conversation must be initiated from within the network. What about stateless? How do they work? Hint, what's the other name for it?
Oh, they work through MAC filtering and packet filtering.
They work through packet filtering, not MAC filtering, but yes, they
Yep.
do work through packet filtering. So they filter through the packets. And they are looking at each individual packet as it goes through the firewall to determine whether or not it is authorized to pass. How does it do that wonderful magic? What tool does it utilize as a reference?
The
to determine-
list.
There's a list.
Yep.
Okay.
ACL?
ACL. And what does that stand for?
ACL, yeah.
Access control list.
Access control list. Yes. And what are the two methods of lists that we would use?
Blacklist and whitelist.
Blacklist and whitelist. Very good. So a couple layers on that question. What are the two types of firewalls? Okay. Packet filtering. What are the ways of the packet filtering filters? Okay. So multi-layers in that question. All right. Content filtering and parental controls. So content filtering, it examines all the web connections essentially, sometimes emails, and it's looking for objectionable content or sites that have been identified as off limits by the administrators. That could be gambling. It could be things like pirate hubs for downloading software and music. It could be things just like sports websites because they don't want you doing that stuff on the clock. It could be things like Spotify and Amazon, where they would limit your access to be able to see some things like that. It could be other adult content, and they're limiting your access to stuff like that. So you can use the content of that particular type of website to determine whether or not that your employees should have access to it and be able to filter it out so that they will not have access. Otherwise known as parental controls. You can do something similar. I think Avery said he used to do something like that with his class when he was teaching school. And so yeah, can you tell about that one again real quick? Just a reminder.
Yeah, so we made use of this software where I was able to basically see anything and everything that the kids would get on, and we were able to create whitelists and blacklists. And So I would basically, if there was one program that I needed them to work on, I would only allow that program because they didn't need any other programs. They didn't need to Google anything. They could do everything through that one website. But if, you know, I could also set it to where I could take specific kids off of that whitelist. So that way they could go and do their own thing. Like if they finish their work earlier, I could set a new list for them. It's just a really good way of keeping people on track with what they need to be doing. Because if you know that you can't do things you're not supposed to, if you know you're not supposed to be looking on ESPN, shopping on Amazon, checking Facebook, and those are just blocked, then you know you don't have anything else to do other than your work. But also really good for your kids.
Absolutely. Yes, TJ.
Okay, yeah. You mentioned something about betting websites. I know New York is one of the states that they don't allow betting websites, but it's, I mean, the moment you get outside New York, you can access those betting websites. But then how are they able to do it in such a large scale like that? Like anywhere you are, any of the networks, either you're on Wi-Fi or you're on the cellular networks, you can access it.
Yeah, it comes down to regional filters for your internet service providers. They're told this stuff is illegal in here, and essentially they're handed a blacklist, like these sites not allowed. So you may get like sites that are just springing up that are new that you'll have access to for like a week or two, and then all of a sudden they get big enough or known enough to where they'll be blocked, and then they're added to those regional filters. So they're using that, it's just at a larger scale, but it's all coming through your cellular providers and your internet service providers with regional filters, which is where VPNs come in handy, because you go into the VPN, you know, say in the Bronx, and then you come out in, you know, Vermont. Vermont's a little more lax when it comes to stuff like that. So you would have access to those sites because in Vermont, it's viewed, you know, your IP address is being viewed as if it's regional to Vermont. Kind of like on Netflix, you know, like when I'm in the US, I don't have access to a lot of anime and stuff like that. But if I, you know, show like I'm in Canada or Korea or, you know, a bunch of other places, I would have access to different regional content.
TJ, so it's so good that a lot of people that I deal with, as far as like YouTubers that's in New York, they say they have to hit a certain tunnel that I guess connects New York to New Jersey. And once they get in that tunnel, they're able to submit their bets or what their wages, whatever. And I was like, wow, like it's that legit. So, and it's weird because like I said, you think New York, you think they'll go ahead and fall in line, but they haven't fallen in line yet. So everybody that's doing it in New York will have to get to New Jersey, because New Jersey's, they're open. They're
Atlantic City, man.
All things fly in New Jersey. So if Kelly, are you done? Because I see Pozo hand is up still soon.
Yeah, Pozo.
Go for it, Pozo.
Yes, I've seen in the movies how, for example, Homeland Security is able to track or to detect if in a conversation or in a web page, I mentioned the word, for example, terrorism or attack, because you can do that through port.
Yeah, it was, I forget the name of the project that enabled them to do that, but essentially they're able to, because like almost all internet traffic for the globe passes through the US. And so they're able to monitor all that metadata. And that was the big controversy with the Department of Homeland Security. And what was it, the NA? I think it was Department of Homeland Security with Snowden, when he leaked all that information, and he leaked it in such a way where he leaked a little bit, and then they would come out and try to defend it. and say, yeah, well, there was this, but we weren't doing this. And then he would leak a little bit more and say, yes, you were. And, he continued to leak this information about, it was the NSA. Okay, thank you, TJ. And basically showing that they were overtly spying on American citizens constantly. Like they have all the metadata for everyone who's on a network. And then they were able to filter through it at will. And they weren't supposed to be able to do that. It was a violation of the Fourth Amendment and a lot of other stuff going on as well. And that was why it was such a big deal and why he had to go into hiding.
Mm-hmm.
So I can't remember the name of the project where I think it was Tyrannus something, I think it was like a dinosaur or something like that. But I mean, it goes back to the Patriot Act. They were monitoring library books. If you were checking out certain types of library books, you would go on lists and then they would try to monitor you for these kind of things. And most recently, they've actually stated that they want to be able to look at your instant messages between my direct messages. Like if I was sending direct messages to Avery, and if they did not like what I was saying, like if I was saying something that went against the current iterations on COVID or whatever. So if I was saying something against that, and I was sending it to Avery saying, hey, maybe you should look at this, they could edit that text in real time so Avery would not receive what I sent. This is something that they have asked for recently. In the last month, they have asked for the ability to be able to do this through internet service providers and cellular services. So real-time censoring and editing of your direct messages on your phone. So that's why I say it's good to pay attention to these things. Keep your antennas up and understand what policies and stuff are coming down the line, especially with regards to technology, because it will affect your ability to do your job. So yes, Rienzi.
Oh, yeah, I just wanted to know if we would be learning about the dark web here.
Nope.
Oh, okay.
It exists. It exists, and if you want a tour, we'll give you the name of the man.
Nope. It will not be discussed here, especially not while we're being recorded.
Oh, that's funny. No, I mean, it comes back to a joke, like where we actually had a student who Marvin was talking about. He's like, "What is the dark web, man? I don't even know. I mean, it just doesn't make sense." And he's talking about it or whatever. And then one of the students goes like, "Hey, Marvin, I could give you a tour and kind of like show you around and what it's all about and stuff like that. Just like."
And he was so unassuming, you would never think that this gentleman spent time there. And I'm like, he was like, no, it's okay. It's certain places you shouldn't go, but for the most part, it's okay. Like, it's almost like he wanted to be my tour guide. Like, and he was like, don't go over there, but over here, they talk about some stuff. And I'm like, oh no, I can't believe you. But yeah, I'm not doing it.
If you get into cybersecurity, yes, you have to become overtly familiar with the dark web because you have to hang out in these hacker hubs and stuff like that, because white hat, black hat hackers hang out there. So you can learn about the threats that are going on now, how they're being performed, how do you prevent against them? Because like a lot of these people feed at the same pools. So you gotta be there and aware of it so that you can know how to counter it. Rienzi, that is something you would get a little bit more involved into if you start stepping into the security fields and stuff like that. But as a general IT practitioner, probably not so much. That might be out of your purview.
I can't remember my email password. I don't need to go in a place like that because I just like I told you, when my computer shut down because because it wasn't powered up, and I was like, oh no, they got me. That's me. I'm already on the edge, so I'm not gonna go there at all. But go ahead, Riz. I'm sorry.
So and also I heard about is it an intranet or another kind of like the dark web? The Onion, is that another dark web type of network?
The Onion is a parody website.
What is that, virtual or something?
It's like a magazine online, but it puts up parody articles.
Oh, it's not it's okay, got it.
So
is it still around?
It is still around. Although there are some jokes about it being more of a a tool for telling the future rather than a parody.
If you could cause yourself to pick up a virus or some kind of malware from visiting something like the dark web, or
Yes, as any website, if you go to any website, if their security is lax, you can pick up viruses from visiting websites. There's something that's called a watering hole attack. So say, everybody here familiar with the CSX railroad? So say I want, like I'm doing it because their home office is here in Jacksonville. So say I wanted to hack into the CSX. Well, CSX has pretty darn good security. They don't, but for the sake of argument, they have pretty darn good security. And no matter what I've tried, I am not able to breach their security to gain access to their systems. Now, though I'm not able to do that, what I can do, I know everybody at CSX, when they're dealing with truck drivers and they want to figure out whether or not it's a good driver, they will go to a website called SafeStat, which is a government website that maintains information on drivers and companies as to how safe their equipment is and how well they are at passing inspections and stuff like that on a regular basis. Do they have any violations? I can go to this website and look. So it's visited quite often. Well, being a government website, maybe it has significantly less security. So what I can do is I can infect SafeStat, so that anybody goes to SafeStat will get a virus. So you have people at CSX then going to SafeStat to get information. They become infected, and then they bring that virus back into their systems after that. So it's a way to perform an attack on a secondary level. So I can't get them directly, but I can get them over here. So I infect that website, they go get the virus, and then they bring it back into their systems, and that allows me to bypass their systems at that point, because then I can have the virus set up to where it reaches out to me to get past the firewalls, and then I'm in. So any website you go to, you can technically get a virus from, depending on the level of securities they have. Some are just more robust than others. You consider Amazon as pretty fair web security, and 40% of all websites on the web are hosted on Amazon servers. Good questions, though. Any other? All right. Disabling ports. So we talked about this one a little bit with port forwarding and stuff like that. So disabling ports, wonderful thing. So say I have a web server set up just to kind of provide information on our company, like a splash page and a couple of things, talking about our mission statement, a couple of things we do, nothing super fancy, just, a nice little web server. Well, I wouldn't need on that web server to be able to access secure shell, FTP, RDP, IMAP, SMTP, like all these other ports. There would be no reason to access those ports on this web server. So what I can do is shut down every single one of those ports, with the exceptions of the ones that absolutely need access. So it might be port 80 and port 443. Everything else shut down. Questions? All right. Firmware updates. I know it's something that people in IT like to try to avoid wherever possible, updating the firmware, because it poses such a risk to the systems as a whole. But security updates are essentially a must when it comes to stuff like that, because over time, people find ways to bypass the security protocols that were already in place. We need to upgrade those, update them so that it is a more secure and robust system. So this is one way we can maintain the security of our systems. It's often overlooked on your systems for you know that you have at your house eventually, or probably every 6 months to a year or so. Check to see if there are any firmware updates for your BIOS. If there are serious security patches involved in it, you may want to consider going ahead and upgrading it. If there is no real security reason to do it, maybe you can put it off at that point. All right. Physical security. As we have talked about in the past, probably one of the most overlooked aspects of security in the IT field, because we tend to put that as, not my problem with regards to the company, because, well, the company wants to take care, protect their people and stuff like that. So they're going to take care of the physical security, right? Not always. We need to take care of that ourselves. I, in fact, worked at a building where we had to have a 5-digit passcode key lock to be able to get into the bathroom, but the server rooms were wide open. You could explain that to me. I have no idea why. So we need to pay attention to the physical security, utilizing things like perimeter fencing, man traps, simple locks, either keypad, or utilizing RFID or security badges, things like that. Yes, Mark.
Where I used to work, when we started to grow, we expanded and we had to move our servers, the equipment, the IT network equipment out of the office, and we moved it out on the wall next to where the break area was. We put it inside a cabinet. Cabinet had a lock on it, but it didn't really work. But we started having problems around lunchtime every day for about 2 weeks. Nobody could figure out why all of the networking stuff and it wasn't the microwaves, it was people.
Really?
They were breaking into the cabinet to plug their phones in, to charge their phones at lunchtime.
Oh, that is hilarious.
Yeah, so it took a long time to figure out what was happening.
That's a new one on me. I have to remember that one, Mark. That's pretty good.
It's semi-related. My best friend who works in security at his old job, they were over a bunch of dentist offices, and he was trying to figure out this issue with this one company's server that would go down randomly. And so he was trying to figure it out for the longest time. Turned out it was a disgruntled employee that would just go into the server room and turn the server off randomly.
Wow.
And they
That's a
didn't know,
DOS attack right there. That's denial of service.
and it took so long to figure it out because they didn't have security cameras in there. They just someone happened to notice them go in and turn it off. And that company was very upset at my friend's company, who's supposed to be, keeping the servers up and stuff. So they were very apologetic after that.
Well, and it's one of those things like we talked about. There's a big difference between 99.9% uptime and 99.99% uptime. Like 99.9 allows for 2 or 3 days of downtime a year. 99.99% I think is 5 minutes a year. And you will pay for that service. So if you want 99.99% uptime, there is a hefty premium. You will pay for that. Because if they fail to deliver on that, there's a hefty fine that the company likely will have to pay.
It's nothing you can do with an employee going in the closet, turning it off. There's no way you can address that without, you said, the type of camera.
Well, if
Camera,
you ahead of
locks.
time, if you have locks, to pay attention to physical security, that could have been avoided.
Well, then that should have been written in the contract.
There's something that companies like to do where they purposely hire security experts to give their advice, but then they don't follow through with
Mhm.
what the advice is given. And so they cover themselves by having the security person on hand,
We had
but they
security
don't actually,
consultants.
but they actually don't implement any of the things that they're telling them they need to implement.
And then when a big
And
event
it's
happens, they
everywhere.
fire that security person.
Yeah, it happens all the time.
Yes, and that's something we mentioned towards the beginning of the cohort, where companies tend to not care about security until there's a breach, which is why being a cybersecurity professional is both can be one of the most lucrative, but it's also one of the hardest to actually land positions, because most companies don't want to pay to employ that until they have a big security breach, and then all of a sudden they really care about it. You have something else, Avery?
No, I think that's it for my stories right now.
Is that for your stories right now?
Yeah.
All right. Any other questions? Okay. All right. So wireless Soho security router overview. What are some things we can do to protect our wireless routers? Some of this stuff's kind of the same. Change default SSID. Set encryption levels. What are the encryption levels we have for wireless standards? I know Mark's tempted, but take your hand away from the mute button, Mark.
Isn't it web, WPA, and WPA2?
Nice.
Very good. That is all three of them right there: WEP, WPA, and WPA2.
Yep.
So that would be a way to encrypt it. And then if somebody was using Wireshark with that encryption, they would be able to see the packets. They'd be able to see origin and destination, maybe what port numbers you're trying to access, but the actual packet of data you're sending itself would be encrypted and for the most part, unreadable by Wireshark. Unless you have decrypting algorithms, and those can take some time. If it's WEP, a couple minutes. WPA, a couple days. WPA2, depending on your software, a very long time. So there's that. Also, disabling SSID broadcast. Again, this is viewed as a security measure, though it isn't really. Anybody with a Wi-Fi analyzer will know there is a Wi-Fi signal there and what it's called. So they'll be able to figure that out pretty quickly. WPS, I don't care what Marvin says, turn it off. This is not your friend. And then antenna and access point placement. So all of these things with regards to your wireless are ways to protect your system. So changing that default SSID. Is there any reason why we wouldn't just change the password to keep the same SSID? Why wouldn't we keep that?
Because the SSIDs are well known by the manufacturers.
Well, I mean, but we're going to change the password, so they still won't be able to get in.
Mm.
So why wouldn't we change the SSID as well? Any guesses?
To make it more connected to your business, to your corporation name or something like that, to remember.
Yeah, you can do, yeah, so that they know they're talking to XYZ Corporation rather than what the original one was. What do those SSIDs normally look like when you first turn them on? What do the generic ones look like?
They look like random letters and numbers or something.
Could be. A lot of times they actually have the name of the company who's providing it in the SSID. So if you get a Linksys router, it'll be like Linksys, 2715. So the reason we change it is to obscure the type of router we're using. Because remember we were saying, if I know the make and model of the router you're using, I can quickly research what vulnerabilities it may have that may have not been patched. Or if you're already that lax on security, what vulnerabilities have been discovered in the last couple of years to gain access to your systems. So a lot can be gleaned.
Kelly, my gateway does start with AT&T. It's ATT and then a whole bunch of numbers behind it. And if I walk outside, I can pick up other ATT starting SSIDs because they just recently came to the area. So more people signed on. So you're totally right. If everybody knows where the fiber is right now.
Have you changed that, Marvin?
I will not confirm or deny this. Avery, do not get off mute because I know you're about to say something.
I figured
Just
after
gotta ask him twice, Kelly.
I figured
You
after
gotta
I
ask
called,
people.
I figured you'd have been all over it after I called out Diego on that.
But it does look very specific, but it is AT&T. So
Yeah.
I'll change it today.
We'll ask you one more time.
Put your bets in chat now. Does he actually change it?
Play some bets.
What's the over under? All right. So yeah, you change your SSID because that can identify the type of router you're using, which would give hackers a good idea of how to access your systems. Setting encryption, WEP, WPA, WPA2. Obviously, we only use WEP if that is our absolute only option. If we have critical systems that are legacy, aka old, that cannot operate on WPA or WPA2, and we have to use it, it's still better than nothing, but just barely. So, opt for WPA2 whenever possible. Although interestingly on Soho routers, sometimes it'll say opt for, was it WPA with AES? Makes it kind of sound weird, right? Because we know WPA operates with TKIP, right? So whenever it says WPA with AES, that's quite literally just WPA2. So we try to keep this on at all times because it does offer another layer of protection. I do believe WPA2 is a cracked protocol, so they do have algorithms that can get past it. It just takes time. But again, it is a layer in our protocol systems. It is not the end all be all. There is no silver bullet to security. We must have multiple layers. All right. Disabling the broadcast. All that basically says is if somebody's trying to discover it, it's not going to show up on their phone as being discoverable. However, if they already have been on your network, have the sign-in and password for your network, they already have access. Even if you disable the SSID broadcast, when they come in, it already knows to look for those two things. So it'll send that out anyway and go ahead and connect to it. So it does not prevent somebody who already knows your network from being able to get in it. Just makes it a little bit harder for the layman to see that network. But again, anybody with a Wi-Fi analyzer is going to know that network's there, what the SSID is, and then that gets them one step closer to getting in. All right. Marvin's favorite, WPS.
Great product right there.
Yeah. All right. Fully cracked protocol. They can even access it without you turning it on. So this needs to be turned off. Whatever device you have that has it, whatever router you have that has it, it needs to be turned off because of the simple fact that there are only so many keys. They were able to be cracked. It only takes a couple seconds, and they can even turn this feature on even when you haven't pushed that little button to make it happen. And it just gives them instantaneous access to their systems if they're within range. So please, please turn it off. Next, antenna and access point placement. Now, antenna placement can be absolutely critical to allow your workers, clients, guests, anybody you want to have access to be able to get onto the network as a whole. General rule, the greater the distance the signal has to go, the more it will, it's called attenuate, which is the signal itself degrading over distance. Same thing happens over wires, which is why we have limits as to how far a signal can go without being repeated. The process is called attenuation or degrading of the signal. Now, with regards to Wi-Fi access points, especially in enterprise settings, you can lose Wi-Fi signal in a very, very short distance because of building materials. You have to take into account reflection, refraction, and absorption with regards to the signals, how they travel through the building. And there's a lot of fun tools you can use to figure this stuff out. This is a little bit beyond the scope of the course, but just being aware of it. And we can adjust signal strength on our antennas. Now, seems counterintuitive, but for security measures, we will likely turn down the power of an antenna more so than turning it up. So more frequently, you will turn down the power of the antenna rather than up. Why would we do that?
Because you don't want it to go beyond the perimeter of where the
Exactly. Perfect. You don't want it to go like if I'm, creating a signal in my office, I don't want it to go into my neighbor's parking lot, because then that just means a hacker can just park in that parking lot and just find ways to try to break into that signal. And there are it's not so much done now, but for some time back in the early 2000s, there was something called war driving, where guys would drive around with wireless Wi-Fi analyzers and find open networks. And when they found these open networks, that would allow them to they would mark these and know where they are around the city, and they could post them. There was also something called war chalking, where you found an open Wi-Fi and the sign in and password, and they would write your SSID and password on the sidewalk by your house or by your office, so that anybody who pulled up would be able to see it, know what it is, and log into it, any hacker that's paying attention. Not so much something done nowadays, but again, it was early 2000s that was the case. Questions so far? I'm not sure whether you have a question mark. Your hand's kind of hanging out there. All right. This little quiz. So go ahead and pause the recording.
A couple of hours.
There you go. So, objectives revisited. We should now be able to explain the value of going the extra effort to protect data on a Soho network. Describe the strategies for securing both wired and wireless Soho networks, and describe the unique strategies for securing a wireless and Soho network.